at a minimum, we have 13 veto points. And I want to emphasize that prepositional phrase, at a minimum. Right? At a minimum, on any given bill, we have 13 veto points. And we haven't even added in the 100 potential veto points in the Senate, represented by individual senators who might be able to filibuster, or might choose to filibuster. But that is a minimum. And here's why I want you to appreciate that phrase, at a minimum. Several things. If the Senate, in the markup process, attaches riders, I don't know, my example might have been a little silly, but let's just continue with it. The original bill is a farm bill, so we've got the House Agriculture Committee and the Senate Agricultural, Forestry, and Nutrition Committee. But if in the Senate they add a rider that deals with funding for the International Space Station, now you're going to have the House committees and subcommittees, House full standing committees, House standing subcommittees, Senate full standing committees and subcommittees that oversee NASA. They're going to have to be in on the process, right? Because many bills require an appropriation. Let me digress here for just a second. The authors of your textbook make a distinction, you remember, between an authorization bill and an appropriation bill. An authorization bill is one that provides the legal authority for a program to operate. Congress sets up some farm assistance program, let's say, assistance to farmers and some sort of subsidy to farmers, right? They have to provide the legal authority for that program to operate. That's called an authorization bill, right? But because so many programs that are authorized require an expenditure of money, then you have to have an appropriation as well, an associated appropriation. So now you've got to bring in the House Appropriations Committee and the subcommittees that are relevant, and you've got to bring in the Senate Finance Committee. That's appropriate here as well. Okay? And oftentimes they're going to have an associated tax measure. How are we going to fund this program? Okay, we're going to appropriate money for it. How are we going to fund it? Oh, maybe we're going to fund it by gasoline tax, right? So now you got to bring in the House Ways and Means Committee and the subcommittees, because that's the committee in the House that oversees tax policy. And then you're going to bring in the appropriate Senate full committees and subcommittees, right? So once you start thinking about riders and appropriations, associated appropriations, and possible tax measures, the number of veto points begins to increase dramatically. I don't know what the mathematical function is. I've never modeled it. I don't know if anybody has ever modeled it. I don't know if it's an exponential function or what. But my intuition tells me that on a typical bill, you might be talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 40, 50, or 60 veto points on any given bill. And there could be as many as 40 or 50 or 60 veto points, places along the way where legislation can be effectively killed. So, again, if you've ever wondered why it is we elect these people, we send them to Washington, and it doesn't seem like they can get anything done, well, maybe now you're beginning to appreciate why it can be so difficult sometimes. Because you have to have so many people, essentially they have to sign off and say, yeah, okay, let's go with this, let's go with this, enact this proposal. Right? Very hard to get that accomplished. And ultimately, when, what does get accomplished oftentimes reflects the art of what is possible rather than the science of what will work. Okay? The way I like to say that is, in this highly decentralized and fragmented Congress that we've been talking about now for a couple of class meetings, we're not thinking about it as a single culminating point of decision-making authority. We understand now that decision-making authority is spread out all over the place in Congress, On any typical bill, you might have as many as 50 or 60 veto points, right? So decision-making authority all over the place, right? Anything that is passed by Congress usually reflects attainable consensus rather than a substantive conviction. Any thoughts? Anybody have any thoughts about what I mean by that? Let's just sort of pick this apart. What's an attainable consensus? Something we can get everybody to agree on, or at least enough people to agree on. The things that the legislative enactments that come out of Congress usually reflect what we can get enough people to agree on, rather than what? A substantive conviction means what? Rather than anything that anyone believes will really work. You think if we had, it may be a dead issue. I may have to stop using this as an example. But, you know, I mean, I think it's a highly visible example that makes this point pretty well. If we could get former President Obama in here and ask him if the legislation that was passed by Congress in 2010 that sort of bears his name, that we popularly call Obamacare, if that was the version of health care reform that he would have enacted, if he could have done it entirely by himself, if he could have just been the only person who had anything to say about it, is that the version of health care reform that you would have passed, Mr. Obama? I wonder what he would say. What do you think he would say? No, there's a lot of stuff in that legislation that I would not, or there's stuff that's not in the legislation that I would have put in. In fact, he said as much when he signed the legislation back in 2010. Go back and look at his little speech that he gave and his signing statement. If we could ask any of the members of Congress who were in, any of the people who were in Congress at the time that they voted on that legislation and who voted in favor of passing the Affordable Care Act, is this the legislation that you would have passed if you could have written it on your own, by yourself? I don't think any of them would say, yeah, this is exactly what I would have written. Nobody thinks that this is the version of health care reform that would work. You want a version of health care reform that will work, enact the version that I proposed. Right? But this is what we could get people to agree on. That's just kind of the way the legislative process works in Congress. You got so many people, so many different veto points, so many people that have to get. Have any of you heard I always butcher these colloquialisms, but have you ever heard the expression, somebody help me out here, how's it go, too many cooks in the kitchen? How's that one go? Too many cooks in the kitchen? Nobody's ever heard it?
I've heard it. It's like it ruins a good stew.
Yeah, something like that. Too many cooks in the kitchen ruins the stew. What? Everybody's throwing in a little bit, it's got to have a little bit more of this. It's got to have a little bit, and by the time, that's horrible. Right? Yeah. That's kind of, I think, the way that we ought to think about the legislative process. Nobody really is convinced that whatever it is that was ultimately enacted is the thing that's going to work.
So that means that anything or any bill we pass is going to be exactly like this. Our tasty soup.
I never like to state things so emphatically, universally. There are always exceptions, right? Like, sometimes legislation gets fast-tracked. Sometimes the situation is such, some sort of emergency or crisis, perception of some sort of crisis, that the legislation gets sort of fast-tracked through the process and the number of veto points really don't sort of play in. That, maybe it's exactly what the president, given this crisis situation, maybe it's exactly what the president's asking for. There's lots of specific circumstances that could arise that would mitigate this somewhat, but we're just talking about a typical, sort of process rather than the exceptional process. Okay, questions about that? So, again, bottom line, we're talking about lots of veto points. I can't give you an exact number. It's just not really possible to do that. But, again, my best estimate is we're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of, several dozen veto points, 40, 50, 60, whatever the number is, that make the legislative process very difficult, very problematic. All right. So let's sort of back off of that and talk here for just a couple of minutes about what we've said. We started by talking about bicameralism. We said that, you have these two different chambers of Congress. Talking about Congress as a fragmented institution, right off the bat, the Constitution imposes a fragmenting condition, doesn't it? Because the Constitution provides for a bicameral Congress, and that means that, if you think it's difficult to get legislation through one chamber, it's doubly difficult, at least doubly difficult to get it through two chambers. Right? So right out of the gate, imposed by the Constitution, we've got a fragmenting condition that makes it difficult, impedes Congress's ability to function in an integrated way and to facilitate the legislative process. Okay? And then, we've talked at some length now for the last couple of class meetings about how the committee system is really at the cornerstone of all these veto points. Okay? The cornerstone of this fragmentation of power. Now I want to move. We'll have to start this next time, but I want to talk briefly about the phenomenon of divided government. Okay, and what really I'm getting at there is the fact that in Congress it has become the rule rather than the exception for us to have one of two forms of divided government, where one political party sort of has control over the process in one institution, and the other political party has control over the other institution.